Welcome, everybody. Y'all having fun at the Project Place Summit? All right, well, welcome to, and I don't say this on every panel, but welcome to what I would say is arguably the most important panel of the conference, because it relates to governance, which is always a dicey topic, always a very complicated topic, always a very consequential topic, and a topic right now that certainly at a national, federal level is somewhat out of favor, right? We're at a time when we're shrinking the size of government, removing regulatory structures, getting rid of inspectors general. We're in a moment of time right now. Yet, but states are different, and states have different opportunities, and that's what this particular panel is about. And the reason we're leaning into it, the reason we scheduled this, is because we do believe, having assessed this environment for 10 to 12 years and having done a lot of research in this space, looking at local systems, states, what's happening at state level, federal, even international sports systems. We studied a dozen or so of those. We recognize that there is a role for government, an appropriate role for government in helping this growing space make efficient and better decisions on behalf of children and communities, right? Again, I mentioned this yesterday, we have the largest sports system in the world by far. Minimum $40 billion are being spent by parents alone on youth sports, twice the size of the amount of money flowing through the NFL or any professional league. That doesn't include the public spend, what's happening with park and recs in schools. That does not include private equity. That does not include all the other sources that are coming into the space. So it is a massive space. And how do you help energy, all this energy, all this money, move less at cross purposes? And that's where you enter into a conversation about government and governance. There are, right now, it's not something that we are even necessarily putting on the table. We recognize the value of it, but there are 6 states around the country that are now considering bills to regulate youth sports in some form or another. Massachusetts, Illinois, New Jersey, Texas, Montana, California. Colorado is considering minimum requirements for community coaches. The public sees youth and school sports as worthy of attention and even investment. Half of respondents in the Olympic Commission survey from a year and a half, 2 years ago, were asked, or said they would support, I think it was like 49% said they would support taxpayer dollars going to youth and school sports. For professional sports and college sports, it was less than 10%. For Olympic and Paralympic, it was right around, maybe a little bit higher. But there's, like, citizens believe in the power of building healthy kids and communities, and they're willing to invest it because they can see how it would directly impact them. So on some level, this is not a conversation that is out of step with Americans. The origins of our work on this topic are really started with me covering the 2018 Olympics for NBC Sports, where Norway won 39 medals and the US won 28 medals. And I'm like, how did that happen? This is a country the size of Minnesota, 5 million people, and they're cleaning everybody's clocks at the top. And then, of course, getting to know the people, the Norwegian folks there, including the architect of their system, who they went back and redesigned everything in the 1990s. I learned that they were probably 90% of kids play in sports clubs there, and that sport is deeply integrated into their national goals related to education and health and refugee resettlement. A lot of Syrians were coming in at the time or otherwise. I'm like, wow, okay, sports isn't something that just sort of sits on the side. It's something that government has thought about using as a tool to achieve, the larger goals of their society. So wrote a piece, went over to Norway again, traveled all over the place, learned more about it, wrote a piece in the New York Times on the topic, then wrote another piece in the Times about Puerto Rico. And what Puerto Rico is doing, I learned, is they have a Department of Sports and Recreation. It's been in place for decades, and it serves a certain purpose. And in some ways, they overregulated. I'll save that for too much detail, but but what they did do well, one of the real learnings I feel like came out of Puerto Rico is if you're offering sports in Puerto Rico, you must register with the Department of Sports and Recreation. So at least they know who you are. They know who is serving kids in their communities. And once you have that registry, now you have an ability to communicate to the entirety of what is, in our country, a very disjointed structure. In Puerto Rico, all coaches get criminal background checks. In Puerto Rico, all coaches get a minimum level of coach training. And that Department of Sports is also able to communicate with municipalities about if they want to build a facility or whatever it is, they might be able to help you. Maybe it's with dollars. It's a fairly poor island. They don't have a whole lot of money. But I'm like, oh, there's probably some learnings, both good and bad, from Puerto Rico that are interesting. So I wrote a piece on that. And so, I came back here and decided to kind of broaden our research. We looked at international sports systems, not just China and, some of the larger systems, but we looked at Spain, we looked at France, New Zealand, Australia, or otherwise, and just looked at their governance. This all exists on our website. Please check it out. It's called World's Leading Sports Systems. They're little 2-pagers, and there's like a flow chart of how decisions are made. What are the government structures that play a role? What are the quasi-government structures, and then what the private sector, and then how does money flow, and who holds who accountable? And these flowcharts are in every single country. Now, what's interesting about that research is, even though it's country-based research, a lot of them are the size of U.S. states. So as you go forward, when you think about Norway, when you think about New Zealand, when you even think about France, which is roughly the size of California, what does that mean? Are there learnings? So we're not just completely starting from scratch. So next step for us is to continue to monitor this environment, but then develop another simple resource on what a Department of Sports and Recreation might look like within any state. We're fortunate to have Fernando here with us today, and he can tell you what California is putting on the table. It's very early days on that one, and we hope that what we develop can be useful to California, but to all of you who live in your states, as you think about talking with policymakers, you talk about sports organizations, how to create these environments where organizations have a seat at the table. There's a level of accountability, but there are also benefits that flow to the sport providers out there. So really look forward to what our panel has to share and the ideas that come out of it. And I'm really thrilled that Michele Newman is going to pull this conversation together for us. She was a senior advisor to former Senator Josh Newman, who was the chair of the Education Committee in the state of California. They are not. They have to preface every introduction that way. Yeah. All right, Michele, thank you.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a huge privilege to be here with all of you today. I'm the moderator for today's panel on building a State Department of Youth Sports. Joining me on stage is a panel of recognized, accomplished experts in their respective fields, which span advocacy, policy, and research. So today we're going to explore what a department or a commission on youth sports could potentially do, how it could expand opportunities, improve accessibility, and strengthen the future of youth sports for our communities. So as Tom mentioned in his remarks, our hope is by the end of today's session, we can create something of a template which could be used across the country as states look to develop their youth sports ecosystems. So we have a lot to discuss here today, and we have an all-star cast of people to discuss it with. And we want to take your questions. This is an interactive panel. We're gonna ask the audience some questions. We want to hear your remarks, but please please join me in welcoming our panel for today. So first we have, to my far right, Fernando Ramirez is the Chief Policy and Public Affairs Officer at LA84 Foundation, leading advocacy, public policy, communications, and marketing efforts. He drives innovations to advance play equity, expand LA84's reach, and strengthen partnerships with policymakers and grassroots organizations. Fernando has also enhanced collaboration with Southern California's 12 professional sports leagues to create career pathways in the sports industry. Before joining LA84 in 2022, he spent over 15 years in public service, holding leadership roles at the city and Los Angeles County level and the California legislature. He holds a political science degree in Chicano Studies from UC Santa Barbara. So welcome. And next to him is Hannah. Dr. Thompson is an assistant research professor at UC Berkeley School of Public Health, specializing in evaluating programs and policies on physical activity, nutrition, and youth health. She's a former physical education teacher. She focuses on improving school-based physical activity through policy and practice. She holds a, K01? Okay, Career Development Award from the NHLBI to study the impact of PE policies on student fitness and health disparities. She has nearly 15 years of experience in education and community health. She collaborates with schools, health organizations, and policymakers. Dr. Hannah Thompson earned her PhD from UCSF, and she has master's in public health and nutrition from Brown University. So thank you for being here. So next to her is former Senator Josh Newman with a career-spanning military service, entrepreneurship, teaching, and elected office. Josh is a one-of-a-kind public servant. Most recently, he served as a state senator representing the 29th Senate District in Orange County. His legislative efforts focused on strengthening local communities, supporting economic growth, and advocating for the rights of veterans and working families. As the chair of the Senate Education Committee, Josh authored landmark legislation, SB 291, which required that every K-6 California student is required to have 30 minutes of unstructured play in their school day every day, and it can't be taken away for academic or punitive reasons. Josh graduated from Yale University with a degree in history, focusing on 20th century American politics. He served the military with a nuclear artillery detachment in Korea, a field artillery battalion in Hawaii. He lives in Fullerton with his wife, Darcy Lewis, their daughter, and their 3 rescue chihuahuas. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. And Sheila, where are you? Here we go. A lifelong competitive tennis player, who's passionate about transformative power of sports and youth development. She advocates for young athletes and mentors through teaching, speaking, writing, supporting organizations that expand access to quality sports experiences. With a BS in finance from the University of Colorado, a CFA, and a PhD in behavioral genetics from King's College London, she applies science to promote healthy development. Based in Denver, she enjoys tennis, mountain climbing, yoga, and time with her 3 sons and 2 golden doodles. And last but not least, Kevin Loeb is a managing director for strategy, learning, and evaluation at the Farrey and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation. Previously, he held leadership roles in Maryland's state local government, including positions with Governor Martin O'Malley and Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown. He served as the chief of staff and deputy director of budget and finance for Baltimore County, a Lehigh University graduate. Kevin is active in the community, serving on nonprofit boards and participating in Bike to the Beach for Autism since 2008. Thank you for being here. All right. So, if everybody can get out their phones and scan the QR code so we can get started here. Sorry about that. Was there anything I was forgetting that I should mention about your work? Okay. So, should I just get started? Okay. So let's hear from our panel. So my question for you is, what would be the purpose of a State Department of Youth Sports? What would a State Department of Youth Sports do? What could it accomplish?
I'm going to force Fernando. Only because Fernando with LA84 is the sponsor of a piece of legislation that is now moving in California to do exactly this, and so which has interestingly changed materially in the very short time it's been introduced. So why don't you start and we can talk about it?
Awesome. One really quick important caveat. I'm here in my capacity as the Play Equity Fund. So the Play Equity Fund was founded by the L84 Foundation, legacy of the 84 Olympics, as our 501c3 partner about 10 years ago, to really look at systems change. And so sort of want to make that clear. Sorry, I know it could be a little confusing. So we are sort of leading an effort around AB 749, and I have handouts, of course. So if folks don't mind, just pass these out. Yeah, that'd be great. SB 749, it's making its way to the legislature. It's a study bill, and it would create a blue ribbon commission comprised of various experts throughout the field that would look at the possibility and feasibility of creating a state entity, is the language we're using, of around youth sports, either a commission or department. It doesn't make that final resolution. The legislature would then have a year, the commission would have a year to report back, and in 2027, make its final recommendations to the legislature. Our approach was broad in nature, so we really did a big tent approach. We threw it, sort of everything in there. It's really informed by our own survey. Last year, the foundation side of our house completed a statewide survey called the California Play Equity Report that really took a statewide picture at what the needs and assessments of California are. That data really informed the backbones that ended up being the bill. So 749, it's making its way through the process. It has its first hearing April 22nd. And so at the bottom of the fact sheet, there is an email from my colleague, James Lopez. If folks are interested in learning more, want to get involved, come on in, the water's fine. We really want to sort of go in a big tent in terms of who comes out in support of this. We've gotten really positive feedback from folks to date in terms of really creating a framework that includes everything. The state, as Senator Newman could probably speak to it, is really fragmented in terms of youth sports. And our goal is to really create this sort of framework that brings everyone in together. And so we're excited. A lot of folks up here have sort of been involved, and a lot of folks in the audience are involved as well. And so we also have been talking to our friends in Illinois with Laureus about their initiative, and have been sharing notes and sort of what's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of what they're advancing.
And let me just add a little bit here. So as Tom pointed out in his earlier remarks, really challenging in any state, but especially a state as diverse and massive as California. So you have jurisdictional questions about which state agencies or entities do have oversight or should, and then you have a stakeholder problem. And we have kind of inequality in lots of ways, but especially in sports and play in California. So upper half the income scale, billions of dollars spent, to the lower half, total atrophy. And so this is a very hard problem to solve, especially when you have to cross all of these different agencies and do it through the legislative process.
I would add the California Department of Health and Human Services is the lead agency. We had to name a lead agency. That's where we felt made sense in terms of bringing in the health perspective and sort of the skill set within the department that would lead the effort.
I would just add to that, there's just, am I on? I'm on, okay. I think I'm on. There's a much bigger story, and that's why we're all here, about what sports is for kids. It's the lifelong ROI that matters. You know, it's the early development, the sensitive period in development, kids having positive experiences in sports, which includes learning to be physically literate, multi-sport participation, which is correlated with psychological resilience. There's data behind this in terms of, you know, what can help save states money over the long haul. And right now, sports is a completely underutilized context for, you know, for preventative health, for experiential learning. The aims are not aligned with the long game of human development. And so within, you know, setting up a Department of Sport at a state level, there is just having some organizational structure so that we can bring under one umbrella not only the program, the education, the safety piece, the elements that are the outside-facing parts of sport, parent education, coach, athlete, administrator, but also look at the economic numbers and look at the long game in terms of how, you know, how much money we are saving over the course of time by providing kids with positive sport experiences early on and access to those young people who need it most. It is a massive protective factor, both the physical activity itself and the relationships they can form with coaches that help them pivot into different areas of life altogether. It's a powerful story. It's one I've lived as first-generation American. Tennis made me what I am, and it just makes sense from an economic standpoint and a societal standpoint.
There it goes. Yeah. That's perfect. First of all, I want a couple notes here. One, so I get to be here as part of a private foundation, which means I don't have to say, because I can't say whether we should have the department or not. I can comment on sort of things I've learned working with our state government in Maryland, our city government in Baltimore. But you know, to preface that, yeah, I want to thank the Aspen Institute, and I don't mean this in kind of a soft way. What I mean is, we're obviously at a point where years down the line of Project Play, we're talking about whether we should be building a Department of Sports. My first Project Play was Colorado Springs. I think that was 3 years ago. This was not a panel. And so I think what that's taught me, and I think should teach a lot of us, is the narrative is building, and the questions are being asked at the state level and the national level about what to do about sport and equity in sport. And that is part of the development of the system. Whether it winds up as coordinating in a governor's office, a mayor's office, or a department, this narrative is grown, right? And the narrative is being built for the kids that don't have the sports, which isn't always what's happened. And I just want to thank them for that. I think that's a really important movement, and obviously there's a lot to do. I think as we think about whether a department's right or not, and I don't know if that's the answer, what I'll say is this, is that we are at a place with sports where we have an equity divide, right? We've got some of the kids, a very small sliver, getting everything, right? It's not atypical of American systems across the board, right? Whether it's finance, whether it's health, we tend to do this to ourselves. I think what's exciting about sport, and I hope we take this into context, I hope California does, Maryland and others, is because we weren't built the way other systems were built, we've sort of been a community-driven model so far, right? It's imperfect, there's some inequities, but we are community-driven. There are lots and lots of community group. We have not been told yet what to do by the government, you know, whether that's good or bad. So we now have this opportunity to enter the public system with a lot of community ideas and a strong set of community organizations. And hopefully, whatever we're able to do, we're able to lean into government not as where all the money is, which is true, and not just a resource point, but we can use it for its best function, which is as a great equalizer. And it can play that role. And I just urge everyone to think about that. That's the role it should be playing in standards and resources for those that don't have.
Thank you for that. So I want to ask a question. You know, with the school recess bill, because we can kind of look at that as a sort of a test case for how to, you know, get legislation passed. So, Josh, when you were working on, when you decided to do the bill, what did you do around coalition building? What did you do to actually You know, I'm learning, watching Fernando and how he is building coalitions for the Assembly bill. But for the Senate bill, what did you do to build support?
Right, and so, as Michele mentioned in the introduction, so, ran a bill 2 years ago to do something that seemed eminently necessary to ensure that every student across California's elementary school gets the same baseline standard for unstructured play and decompression every day. And it's surprising to learn that there was not an existing standard in a state that seems to regulate everything. And so, as we got started, surprised by that fact that there was so much kind of inconsistency across the state. But as we got into the legislative process, how impressively hard it turned out to be. And so, if you consider, and our state's probably not different, the most precious commodity in a school day is time, and it's very inflexible. And so the pushback came not from parents, not from kids, not from educators, not from teachers, but from administrators, from superintendents and from principals who, in a good faith way are trying to make the day work, but, took this as an additional burden, even though the arguments are pretty obvious that there's a net return. And so I was really lucky. Actually, two of the folks with whom I worked are here. So Play Equity Fund and Hannah from UC Berkeley, you were one of my witnesses in a couple of hearings. And so we put together the coalition that turned out to be necessary. And as the bill moved through, unfortunately, it got amended, as these things do. And the thing that got stripped out was the enforcement mechanisms. And so, we now have a standard in California, but it's not clear that we'll have sufficient compliance because there really isn't an enforcement regime in place. And so the governor's office, at the end of the day, in every state, the executive has to sign off on a bill. And there was this long pause between the bill moving out of the Assembly and then sitting on the governor's desk. And I think, the coalition then became really important. And what we wound up doing, please don't tell anybody, is I gave the cell phone number for the governor's assistant on education to everybody in that coalition, and they hassled her, and she got back and said, somebody gave my cell phone out. I said, oh, that's terrible. But at the end of the day, I think that's what it took, and that's what it's going to take across other aspects of sport, because you have a political problem, and the problem is simply this, is elected people get as much credit as they probably need, rhetorically supporting these kinds of initiatives. But when it comes down to the details, these are not simple questions. And so putting in place statewide regimes to look at sports across all of the different jurisdictions is an immensely complex thing. So it's going to take a community effort to do that.
Can I just add, I think, to Senator's point, political leadership is also key. I think finding members that value sport, play, and movement in the building is really critical. The senator was a staunch advocate, unapologetically. He happened to be chair of the education committee, which didn't hurt. And so really pushing that question, I think finding those advocates in the building is key to sort of advancing the work. And then the external pressure. I'll give a shout out to folks from the Coalition for Sport Equity, sort of nationally, really looking at these questions of sort of systems change, information sharing, in terms of how we can advance that sort of locally and nationally as well.
Wonderful.
I can add to that. Sports is education. Sports is experiential learning, incredibly powerful form of experiential learning, where kids learn these skills that really make more of a difference, across life and things that matter that we measure. Everything we measure across human development is bolstered by participation in sports. And then we have the preventative health element, which is at the foundation of everything else. And so the education piece, I think, is redefining, rebranding sports for what it is, for what it actually is in the lives of kids, the combination of movement and relationships and learning these skills and learning to face challenge and growth mindset. These are things that just pay off in a big way over the long game of life that are hard to quantify. I mean, measurement is expensive, it's messy. Things don't always show up in a survey the way they don't always show up at a specific time. So a survey can only capture what's happening in a certain moment in time. But if you look at the data across the lifespan, sports is education and sports is preventative health. So I think there's an element of redefining what sports is that's vital here.
Wonderful, thank you. So I want to get back to what actually a state commission or department would actually accomplish. So now, Hannah, you You have, a lot of experience with physical education and children's health. So if you were to create a department or a commission on sports, youth sports, would a PE teacher actually have a seat at the table? Would that be helpful and useful?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm an epidemiologist. I study the epidemic of inactivity in our kids, and we have a real crisis. And from my professional perspective, that crisis starts in the school setting, and it starts with elementary physical education. So just here in California, for example, half of our students in California, over 150 million elementary students, go to school in a district that doesn't even have a PE teacher on staff. Right? My kids go to a Title I school down the street in Alameda. My first grader and my fourth grader each get 50 minutes of PE a week. So how many of you got more than 50 minutes of PE a week growing up? Okay, how many think 50 minutes of PE a week is okay? Right? Our law in California is 100 minutes a week for elementary students, the equivalent of, but as Senator Newman said, there's no accountability for the law and there's no funding for the law. So PE, we know, is that really important time for kids to develop those foundational, those fundamental skills, right? We wouldn't have a kid having 50 minutes of math a week and then going to middle school and expect them to take algebra. And that's what's happening with PE. We have kids that don't have PE, that don't learn those fundamental skills at an early age, and they get to middle school, and I've done studies with middle school teachers, they have kids that don't have any of those foundational skills. So how would you expect them to join a soccer team, a basketball team? They don't have the confidence, they don't have any of those things. And so I think, fundamentally and foundationally, if we're gonna talk about youth sports across the state, we have to talk about meeting kids where they are to get them to the place where they can actually get out on the field, and that's in schools, and that's part of public education. So absolutely having PE teachers, having schools as part of this conversation is critical.
Wonderful, thank you, Hannah. I want to talk a little about athlete safety, and I know that Sheila, you mentioned earlier, you were sharing a story about your experience at tennis. So, and I know that there's some legislation in your state that's around keeping kids safer. Can you talk a little about that?
Last year, Colorado passed the Safer Youth Sports Act. It will go into implementation in July of this year. There are two parts to it. One is, it sits with the AG's office. It's around mandatory reporter training and then background checks. The second part sits with the Department of Early Childhood Education, and it's around a parent code of conduct, coach, and child code of conduct. I believe administrator code of conduct should be in there as well. But there are those two elements that they're finalizing language on right now. There's draft language out. There's a lot to be done to get it ready for prime time in July, but it's incredibly exciting because we're the first state to pass legislation of this nature, and other states are looking to us to follow, to emulate. I have a personal relationship with this issue. At age 15, I was sexually abused by my tennis coach, who was like a father to me, and I was a very good tennis player. Career was going up and to the right, and everything fell apart, really, completely fell apart for a couple of years. And it's why I found out, when I found out 12 years later it was still happening with the same coach with other teenage girls, it fostered a pivot out of it was an investment career, doing well, but my extrinsic motivation waned, and I needed to do something that was intrinsically motivating. So this is incredibly important legislation, and I will say that coaches can be a source of trauma. They can also be a massive source for healing, and thankfully I've had many more of those extraordinary coaches, including one that I've just recently reconnected with. She's 91 years old, and she wrote me a letter after the state final in 1983, just affirming, who she commended me for my intensity of play, but also for my sportsmanship. And she said, use these skills in your whole life, and you will do the very best that you can, and that's really all we can do. But she said there were no losers on the court that day. And she didn't even know who I was. She just happened to be there at the match. And it was a letter that helped me redefine a path forward in terms of what I wanted to do and who I was. And so this is, there's coaches who are in and out of kids' lives regularly with the travel team. There are teachers. There are individuals who are there on a regular basis, and then there are also these kind of random touch points that happen. And for kids, especially kids these days, especially our under-resourced kids, every single touch point matters. And so having people who have coaches with developmental aims, who are focused on the long game for kids, helping them see a story about themselves that they can live their way into and believe about themselves is it's a massive asset. So getting legislation in place and enforcement is vital. And I'm proud that Colorado is first, and hopefully others will follow.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So we polled our audience to see what they thought that the purpose of a State Department of Youth Sports is. My vision's terrible, but Jennifer thankfully helped me out here. So it looks like the #1 reason is to ensure access, so reduce some of the barriers to youth sports. And the second would be to coordinate across the ecosystem. And then the third was interesting to me, to develop useful data and research. So we can never underestimate the value of good data to make informed decisions. So, so thank you for that. So are we going to, okay. So the next question is, we'd like your input on is,
Should pop up in the little website right now.
All the above. I'm just kidding you.
No, you get to check all the reply.
so what entities would the department oversee? Oh.
Come on, guys.
We can see where the problems are.
Can you see this one, guys?
What are the options? All right. Jennifer, can you write down the answers? Are people still voting? Okay, all right. So panel, what do you think of the response from the audience? Fernando?
Yes. Yes to all of them. Yeah, I think that was, yeah, yes to all of the above. Yeah, I think that was the goal with the big tent approach, sort of posing all of the questions and tentacles. It's funny when you try to sort of look at the government structure and make it work. I think that was the first reaction. You could probably relate to that. Sort of, where does it fit? It doesn't fit, right? Otherwise it would be there. And so I think that was sort of how we looked at addressing what the commission could look like and touching all the fields. And so we think it should be all and not eliminate anything as we pose the question and go through our process that we've laid out. And so that's sort of how we've approached it, and really uplifting the grassroots, sort of the folks on the ground who really know better than anybody else. And so of those of lived experience. And so the commission would include those folks as well. And that's sort of what guides our work. The data we had showed in the 90 percentile that folks would support greater state investment in youth sports, and more importantly, support play equity. So realizing the inequities within sports, I think that was an 89% data point in terms of once explained what play equity is, understanding the value of a kid that doesn't have the opportunity to do so, and that's what sort of has been driving some of the key factors of our work. So
let me add, in the realm of equity, and I'm pleased to see that middle column, which is Facilities and Parks Department. So this is a really unfortunate thing in California, but I'm sure other places, where school districts and public jurisdictions make really big investments in athletic fields, et cetera, at schools. But on a weekend at night, they're fenced off, they're locked off. And the very taxpayers who funded these programs can't benefit from the use of these facilities. And often in underserved areas, that's the only place for play. And so that's an area that I think should get much more attention. But again, it's inherently cross-jurisdictional. So this is where it's going to take a broader kind of from the top effort.
I would add to that, just coordinating coach education within all of these entities. I say all of the above. Parks and Rec, it's where, most of our kids, between schools and Parks and Rec, it's where they experience sports first, or that kind of physical activity. But having, aligned resources around coach education, parent education, under the umbrella of a state department to facilitate quality and making sure that in order to work with our youth, coaches get trained and they get safety background checked throughout all of the different arenas here.
Thank you for that. Yeah, to Josh's point, it's always a little infuriating when these communities that are really park poor to not have, these kids have the ability to play when it's really just, it's a little supervision and an unlocking of a gate. That's, where I come from. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
I'm gonna take the prerogative of the one that gets to control the Q&A mic and ask Kevin a harder question because he's worked in government before. When we look at the screen, there are a couple different types of entities that we could potentially regulate. And being one of the government insiders on this panel, which do you think in sports is going to be more impactful to potentially regulate? The people, the places, or the programs?
That was a lot of oohs across the board. I'm going to try to answer with equity here. My experience kind of previously in government, but now as a pretty large funder in the Baltimore area. I mean, we do about 150 million grants a year, but we do them in Baltimore, in New York, in San Francisco Bay Area, Hawaii, and some other places as well. And we do about $40 million a year in Baltimore. And so, our comparative advantage is getting to sort of see all these different things function at once and realize in reality they just need to all function together, right? And that's just kind of what we view, right? And so, my experience now has become anecdotal but system-wide, which is I look at our interscholastic school programs in Baltimore City, our interscholastic sports system in Baltimore City, right? And the mayor's goal has been, I want universal access for every middle school student to be able to play high-quality sports, right? And we've just left out all these kids, right? So if you're a kid with a physical challenge, right, you haven't had a place to play, right? And so we're talking about things like, what about more easier access to things like bocce and like lighter barriers, right? So there's this piece where the school programs themselves are like wildly under-resourced, and there are really good questions on saying, look, government does have control over the funding of its school system. The mayor's offices and the county executive's office have huge power in funding these systems, and we're talking about multi-billion-dollar budgets, right? So if I'm sitting there as government, one of my first thoughts is, look, what do I actually have the power to impact, on a day-to-day basis, right? And that is the budget, the way I spend our resources, the way I look at our rec and park systems, and the way I can fund our school systems. And if you look at budgets, I'm betting you across most of this country, definitely at the local jurisdictions, you're not seeing a large line item for, youth sports development. You're seeing plots across rec and sports and interscholastics, but then when you actually meet the folks, and I'm sitting there at the mayor's office in the Baltimore City school system, and there's, they doubled in size from 2 to 4, right? That is like a fourth of the size of the private school school athletics programs. So I'm just giving that sense. The out of school piece, the coaches has sort of become an obvious. I think we know this, right? Like we wildly misunderstand in so many people the power of coaches for good and for bad, and I think that's kind of a no-brainer. And there's people that know this area better than I do, so I won't speak to that too much. The one thing I will say is right there on the out of school programs, there are just hundreds of programs in just our little city of Baltimore, right? And it is unclear what it looks like. How do we measure quality? How do we think about the kids' social and emotional benefits? How about their physical benefits? We don't know because there's no central sort of data collection. There's questions about how to do that and how to do that best, but there is no doubt that there is room for taking a look at these programs, knowing what's there, and getting some view onto what these kids are receiving. And the reason I say that specifically in this context is because most of these kids being served in these, at least in these large cities and rural America, that we're not seeing are much lower income and don't have the access to the ultra high quality sports programs. Those are the kids whose coaches I am as worried about and whose programmatic structures I'm as worried about. So I think government gets a lot of these, but I want to lift that one up, that out of school time, because there's just tens of thousands of programs going to the US, and we have no idea, whether about the efficacy, about the coach, and about player experience outside of what they're self-reporting, and that's a big one.
Thank you. Hannah,
I
please.
would love to just build on that. The value of a department like this would be to standardize data and data collection and what we actually know. So when Senator Newman came to me and said, we want to do this recess bill, what does recess look like in California? I said, I don't know. We don't collect it at the state level. We have no idea. And I was, fortunately able to access data through a relationship with our Department of Public Health to give him an answer. But across the country, we have no idea, right? And we do these little studies in little places that have relatively small sample sizes. But to be able to get data that really speaks to what the situation is, where the inequities lie, that's what enables us to develop the programs and policies that specifically get at where our problems are. So a lot of the things we make assumptions, right, and then we make our best guess with a program or a policy solution, but if we really want to drive change and we want to do work that's evidence-based, we actually need the evidence. And so being able to get data across the board, right, on what physical activity kids are getting, what that coach quality is like, what the program quality is like, what the facilities quality is like, all of those sorts of things would be really amazing.
And if I could add, the one area that got the least attention actually is probably deserving of more scrutiny, which is camps, right? And so if we think of play as sort of necessary for kids, there's a midpoint which, on the resource drive side, we got to figure out how do we get more kids involved. But on, we have now this phenomenon, and Tom touched on it earlier, of wealthy parents who are overemphasizing sports. And what you see quite often with these camps is it's the coach of the team running the camp, and the coach is effectively extorting from the family the obligation to come to the camp if you want to continue playing on that coach's team. And we can argue about kind of the ethics of that, but the really worrisome thing is it strips the joy out of sports for those kids. And so we're seeing kids who are over-specialized at a very early age, and we lose the benefits of play, and you lose the benefits of the investment moving forward. I'm sure that Sheila can talk to that as well as anybody.
Joy. I mean, joy's it. It's the name of the game. And in scientific research, the word for joy/fun is engagement. And what drives engagement for young people is having positive experiences, and that is fun. Fun is not just kind of chasing butterflies. It's my friend, colleague Amanda Visick at GW Milken School of Public Health is the leader on the fun research in the world. But the main kind of factors that drive fun for kids are working hard, learning, getting better, the relationship with coach, relationship with teammates, mental skills, growth mindset, these kinds of things that are aligned with the top theories of positive youth development. Sports is experiential learning. It just is. And fun is the name of the game. So making it fun and not having it be, an experience that is, where a coach is yelling or shoving sports down a kid's throat or putting pressure on them or what have you to perform. I mean, performance is the outcome of joy, ultimately. Health and joy leads to better outcomes on a performance standpoint too, but it's the performance element is just a tiny part of the picture. A tiny percentage of kids play NCAA, a tiny percentage of that percentage go on to play pro. It's about the long game, and there's a massive ROI involved, but it's about the joy and the fun.
I would just add,
Fernando.
California data, our data showed top 3 reasons kids stopped playing: cost, transportation, and third was no longer fun. To me, that was the most fascinating data point. And then it's also important to get, my former boss used to say, don't get mad, get data, right? But also the type of data that we get, the types of questions you ask. We oversampled the Central Valley and far northern California as we look at California, right? 2 parts of the state often overlook. Our data showed Black and Latina females as the most inactive in terms of sport. And so centering those voices as we develop what this infrastructure looks like is important to sort of the larger picture of inequities and development policies that work for everyone.
Thank you for that. Hannah, did you have something to add? Oh, I saw you shaking your head in agreement. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. Are we going to ask the next question on, so because we're talking about data, obviously, I think, well, you know, I wonder if if you were to create a department or a commission, did you want me to wait? So,
Standalone government agency within an existing agency, education, parks and rec, children, youth, and health. Quasi-governmental, like many high school associations or other countries like Sport England, or independent of government.
Raise your hand, those 5 of you.
And we're
What?
seeing a disturbing drop-off in participation here.
come on, everyone. We want your input. Is it working?
So it's the same participation, they just get one.
I apologize.
Okay.
I think the
So let me start. I'm sorry, Sheila, go ahead. So, you know, this question about within an existing agency, and Fernando's, the sponsor legislation actually ran head-on into this. You know, you've got a bunch of, if you're talking about youth sports, at some point in California, you're talking about the Department of Education as it relates to PE and after-school programs. So talk to that a little bit, because you had to strip that out of this moving legislation.
It's technically still in there, so it's on print. So it's moving. It's sort of, it's slowly moving. Yeah, so it's sort of, I talked in the beginning, sort of Health and Human Services is the lead agency. I think that was sort of a back and forth with the stakeholders, as I would call them, in government, and sort of looking at that, because education is sort of its own entity, insert your word there, in terms of how it's done. So that's the angle we're taking here. I think that's the path that'll work for us. Not that it won't potentially look at what the larger questions are, right? You can't not ignore sort of what a kid does every day in terms of what they do and sort of their touch points to youth. So that's how we approached it. I think that's sort of the perspective as you're developing policy. You have to be open to friendly amendments, is what I would say.
And so the biggest issue for anybody in any state is, I guess there's two. One is these things will reside in the executive branch somewhere, in state government. So it really depends on the executive, the governor himself or his staff, you know, agreeing that this is important, and then it's resources, and making sure that the resources are committed to first implement, but also to oversee.
So, you know, what's kind of exciting about this, honestly, is that no one's made a decision, right? And there are a few thousand local counties, right, in this country. And what I hope, actually, as I look at this, is we create a lot of structures, right? In a way, it's the beauty of local government and the state governments is that there is some diversity in structure to meet communities' demand, community needs, and the diversity of needs. And so, you know, as this system of thinking through government's involvement in sport develops, I hope that folks develop as they see fit, and that it's really community-driven, right? And that we start to get to see several models develop. And as we look at places like, it's called MACO, but the Maryland Association of Counties, or the Association of State Governments, the National Association of State Legislatures, we start to, and Aspen is a perfect player for this, we start to think and watch very quickly as these things develop what's working and what's not. Because I think very quickly we'll make a lot of mistakes, right? We'll have a lot of positives, but we can start to see the different structures that maximize resources towards youth sports, that think about equity the best, that think about physical health the best, and that are willing to take on things like upstream preventative, you know, models of health, which are something this country has just never seriously, you know, taken into account. So I actually see this as kind of a good thing.
preventative health is a massive issue here, and I think public education is public health. I mean, they go hand in hand. You can't educate a child who's not healthy, and you can't keep a child healthy who is not educated. My concern about an agency inside of another agency is, would it have enough power to be heard and to advocate for the things that are vital for this to be successful. This is going to be an integrative function where there's data, there's program, there's oversight, all the things that are needed for a program like this to thrive and really help our kids, and to understand what the numbers are, just so we have the access issue. We're focused on where we need to focus for the access issue. So, with education changing, like under our eyes, every time we open up the newspaper, there's something new happening. Certainly sports deserves its own space, and the out-of-school time space. There's the in-school time space and out-of-school time space. I believe that both should be included in a department. But we've got to be able to, as Hannah said, get the numbers. Like, we have lots of research studies, tons of research studies, small ones, big ones, meta-studies. They all point to the same conclusions around sports and human development when kids play consistently over time. But we need to have state-level data where we can understand stories and really begin to calculate economics around it, so we can make smart decisions about how to invest.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up now and invite you to ask questions. Do you want to just stand up? I'm sure we can all hear you. Just.
I'm Emmy Huffnagel. I'm from Fields and Futures in Oklahoma City. We're running data on 33,000 students in Oklahoma City public schools, and we're finding that the benevolent childhood experiences from sports can have a positive and healing impact on kids who have had adverse childhood experiences. So I'm curious if that's included just as a policy discussion point at the state level.
I guess I'll start. It should be, but one of the problems with state level politics is it doesn't often allow for the kind of longitudinal arcs that you need to see what cause and effect look like. And so in California, we have term limits, so you get a lot of turnover in the legislature, and everybody comes with their own ideas. And my idea is awesome, and said that 6 years ago that can't be useful. And because of that, we're not really good at looking at data and developing evidence-based practices of long line data. And in California, this is a particular problem. It's just, we have not been collecting fitness data for the last 5 years since the pandemic. So we're really blind to these things. And so again, I'm grateful to Hannah and some other researchers for elevating this issue, but it's a bit of a void right now in my state.
There's Hope Science, and there's a Hope score that we have a social work, the director of social work at the University of Oklahoma, he's running data on this, and it's empirically, validated. I mean, Hope Science is a thing that has been proven to show that your self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to have access to resources and to be able to positively impact your future, that measure is being taken with regard to students. So students are answering a range of questions about, do you believe that you can impact your future in a positive way? What's your hope? And the hope score that we're taking, we're seeing from kids that are involved in sports as opposed to the kids who aren't, is a really positive, indicative. I mean, we're just gathering all this information. So I'd love to explore the topic a little bit more with you all. I just think it's hugely valuable for the mental health. And we lead the country in ACEs in Oklahoma, so.
Yeah, and I think part of we have and don't tell my dean this, we have plenty of research, plenty of science. We don't need to do more science saying that physical activity is good for kids, that sports benefit kids. We know this. I was just talking to somebody from Nike here, and I was saying, I don't know any of you remember this commercial from the mid-90s that was like, if you let me play. And it was all about these girls saying, if you let me play, I'm less likely to get pregnant, I'm less likely to use drugs, I'm less likely to let myself be abused by a man, right? This was 30 years ago. We know all of this. The science is there. Where we need the work is translating that science into action, right? And teachers, schools, principals know my kids are happier when they're active, but there's still that missing link, right? Where's our funding coming? Our funding comes when students perform well in tests. So they put them in math thinking that that's gonna make their math scores go up, even though the science says if you let them be physically active, their math scores are still gonna go up. And so I'm not arguing against science, love research, but like what we really need is this like next step, this implementation science, right? Like how do we take the evidence that we have and actually translate it into action? And I think, by trying to bring all these entities together instead of staying really siloed within, oh, this is school day, this is after school, this is weekend, right? Like this is where we know that we can make the most collective impact towards our kids' health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's...
So one thing that we didn't touch on was the economic cost of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I actually worked with Nadine Burke-Harris for a while. She was a former Surgeon General of California, focused on ACEs, reducing ACEs in California and around the globe. But the cost of a child who has, well, the cutoff is 4, but it depends on the ACE. A child who's had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, if you look at the top 10 causes of death, 8 out of 10 of the top 10 causes of death are amplified by 2x with 4 or more ACEs. And then you look at chronic disease, you look at heart disease, you look at cognitive failure, you look at congestive heart failure, lung disease, these massively costly areas of chronic disease that are triggered by the stress response, basically early on in childhood with chronic stress. When a child's experienced trauma, it can rewire their mind-body system around the toxic stress response, and it amplifies inflammation in the body, and it just sets a child up for they're much more likely to have poor chronic health outcomes, poor behavioral health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes. It's all connected, and it's costly for our society and quality of life for these, just getting kids set up early on in life with what they need. And certainly sports is a massive, context for healing. And there's a lot of research on that too. There's more on team sports versus individual sports, but I'm a believer that every sport has its own group of people. You find your family within every sport, but there are all kinds of arguments to focus on this trauma-informed coaching, and it's really about being a nice human being and being a good human, showing up, caring, being supportive. And again, if you look at the big picture positive youth development data, there are 3 major factors that comes down to, very positive development. This is from the 4-H studies of positive youth development. Having a safe, trusted adult, a solid adult figure in your life, doesn't have to be a parent, learning skills that will help you in life, and then getting a chance to practice these skills and be valued for them in an external community context and embedding those skills. So this combination in sports is powerful more than most other contexts I can think of. It is multimodal learning at its finest, and it's healing.
This is just a broader comment about this whole conversation around data, right? And I feel like there's hundreds of people here, right? And I don't know if I've talked to anyone who said, I'm not sure sports work, right? And most people I've talked to had some sports experience, some negative for sure, but 99% pretty positive in general, right? And they know this experience. And as has been said, there is so much data on this. So it is a question of like, well, what's happening then, right? If there's all this data to show we know what works, why aren't we doing it, right? Why isn't it happening? How come we're still blowing whatever trillion it is today on hospital systems that are getting you at 75 when you're morbidly obese and dying? Not kidding, right? When diabetes patients are filling our hospitals every day. We watch it every day, and yet they get all the money. And so I want to challenge this group to think about, especially those with data in hand, that this question isn't just about data. It's there. There's research. It's there. It's really about power. right? It's about who is making the decisions in your state capital, who is making the decisions in your city and your government. And this is a tough conversation to have. As someone who's spent time in a governor's office, spent time in local government, the conversations aren't around, wow, I'm really thinking, in most cases, there are plenty of politicians and plenty of administrators that are focused on this. But the general conversation when you're in a county executive's office and the governor's office is about budgets, it's about money, and if you look at, and I do it all the time just to know where the power is, who are the top lobbying organizations in your state? Maryland, it's pharma, right? Trying to protect interest. It's major hospital systems trying to make sure they get paid. Some of the unions, right? And then a series of corporate entities, right? Retailers, tobacco, alcohol. They are blowing all the money there. I haven't seen a sports association for youth sports, putting $5 million into Maryland State Capitol ever. So there's no power. And so it's a good question to think about. If we know the answer and all these hundreds of people and Aspen's organizing information, to think collectively about pulling that information together nationally and locally and doing something with it. So that is just a challenge to the group.
Okay. Troy Selvey with the California After School Network. Know some of you, haven't met most of you. My question is really centered around, as someone who sits adjacent, right? You all have kind of referenced either SEL, social emotional learning, positive development, even the out of school time spaces. And talking about the need for folks to be able to have those kind of resources and working with sport from the vantage point of looking at outside agencies to partner with, as that was kind of one of the things. How do you leverage, or how do you think about leveraging after school spaces, which we know these things are already happening in, as a potential space? And the last thing that I will ask, and this is not necessarily just for you all, but for everyone that's in this room, thinking about yourself, how do you identify? If we are identifying as coaches and we're working with youth, when do you work with youth? Most of the time, as my experience as a former high school coach, I'm working with youth after school or on the weekends. So how do I identify myself or those who work with coaches as out of school time practitioners? And does that land with people in this room?
Larry? Well, while you're thinking about it, getting back to this question, power translates into resources. And Hannah's right. I mean, everybody here, you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe in the power of sport and play. But in California, as an example, we have a massive state budget, but it's not particularly flexible. And so where we've made investments in, for instance, extended learning opportunity programs in the schools over the last couple of years, it was one-time money, unfortunately. We had the benefit of some federal pandemic money. We had a surplus for a little while. And so we made short-term investments, but with no real commitment or assurance that they would extend. And because of that, nobody knows where those funds are coming from in the future, even though everybody knows they're necessary. And we really don't have the capacity to look at best practices within that and then replicate them to ensure that we get the long-term benefits. And so that's where I think advocacy is so important. And I've been impressed lately in California that a bunch of PTA sort of type groups have gotten much more aggressive and effective, but it's competing in a really noisy advocacy environment.
We're loud, though. Just the organizer in me is just pumping in. So I know, folks, there's a clipboard right in the front.
You knew this was coming.
So if you're interested in expressing an opinion on the legislation, put your name and email legibly, please. We'll share the information. I think the power is in our collective impact and our voice. And so we're really taking the effort of organizing folks. Would love to hear if folks can send a letter, show up. We'll be there 9 o'clock on April 22nd in Sacramento. So please sign up. The water's fine. Come on in. The more the merrier. We really want to show United Front, which touches all the sectors. So we might not have all the resources, but we have the collective power of everyone together. So.
And let me add, I mean, if you've never advocated directly in any, I don't know, everybody here isn't just from California, do it, right? Because it is an eye-opening experience. And you will see some cases you'll be pleasantly surprised at the impact you have. In other cases, you will be educated in a way that's probably unfortunately necessary as to how the world really works. And that's probably a really necessary starting point for this kind of work.
My name's Lawrence Gordon, Charlotte, North Carolina. I run a sports basketball program, and one of our goals is connecting West and South Charlotte, connecting communities, building social capital. One thing that I asked when we were in Baltimore last year, and another question I will pose, when we start talking about developing departments, one thing I don't see is the shoe companies. Nike, Adidas, Under Armour, and now Puma, I mean, they literally invest millions of dollars into communities in major cities across America to identify the next LeBron, Steph, LaMelo, fill in the blank. And so when we talk about specializing in sports, when you have these shoe companies investing millions of dollars, primarily in low-income areas, because that's where a lot of the athletes are, right? And so when we talk about building departments, why don't we see the shoe company piece, right? We have Under Armour here, we have Nike here, like we have a lot of these leaders here, but never does it come up of like, hey, we literally invest millions of dollars into youth sports, and we don't see hey, for the love of the game league in these cities. No, we see very specialized, highly concentrated to try to identify pros. And why don't we see that in the data in terms of like, why aren't they at this table?
So I think that too is fragmented. And the important, I think, if I would ask all of you to think about the question, if we are to put it in place a system that perpetuates itself, that is a system that we need for it to be, how is it funded? How do we get a sustainable cross-sector funding into place that comes from all different sources? And some of that will be preventative health, the field of medicine, from business, from government, from the shoe companies, from the pro teams. There'd be a philanthropic element as well, but how do we get sustainable cross-sector funding into place? What does that portfolio funding stream look like? And then how do we assess the needs in our various states to align those revenue streams? But it takes a village. This is a group effort, and thinking through specifically what those numbers are is vital.
Thank you.
And really quickly, it's a really interesting question, and I think part of it is that system grew up driven by market dynamics, and it apparently works well enough for the shoe companies. And so the question for us is, how do we align the structures that we aspire to create with those incentives so that there's a broader impact, more broadly shared? And I'm not sure there's an easy answer there, but it's something I know that some of your partners at Play Equity.
I think working together, like we work closely with Nike in terms of systems change work. So I think it's all of the above, not just sort of one. That's the goal intent behind the bill, right? The government should be doing something it's not doing enough now, is what we're arguing. And so sort of looking collectively at that, I think, is sort of would be my response.
And I just would add to that, as you think about just corporate engagement on these issues, it's a very, very complicated topic, right? I was having a conversation earlier with a couple of folks in this space, and my concern is sometimes we talk about federal, if we were talking about this federally, right? If we're talking about regulating this industry on a national basis, is we sort of have this very mixed experience with how the United States interacts with corporations, right? We tend to work for them. If you look at any recent time, the agencies aren't as regulated as they regulate sometimes the government, right? And so when you're bringing in corporations and you're talking about the private markets and competition, we just really need to think deeply about how will that affect low-income kids, right? What does it mean if one company gets at the table, if corporations play the role? Right now, one of my great concerns, and Aspen brings it up to me all the time, is that private equity is starting to purchase youth sports leagues, right? And that is like talk about a drive to profit. The end result of private equity firms, of the 28-year-olds that run them in New York, and I think it's 28, I love to be in 28, but these are folks, they care about one thing, a ton of money. And that is all they care about. There's no private equity firm saying, God, I really am thinking about low-income African-American kids in West Baltimore. Boy, I want to focus all my money on that. They're saying, I want to make $15 million this year. Makes a series of decisions. So as we watch the private sector play in this, I think as we think about government's role and our role, we're talking about kids that don't have everything that most people in this room have. How do we think about them first, money and all the other things second?
Thank you, Kevin. So I think it's pretty clear that a State Department on youth sports could have a really transformative effect on the way we, on our sports ecosystem. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you for your work in advocating for kids and improving sports and lowering, creating more access, lowering bars. I want to thank our panelists, and I hope today's conversation was interesting and productive. So thank you.